The thing I want to talk about today is journalism is at a critical inflection point. It needs to change, it needs to evolve, it needs to become more relevant and useful for the audience. This is the truth of the matter. Stories matter, they're important, they're the way to present and connect with an audience. Once upon a time, journalism was very different. This is the way it looked in the late 20th century. Information, everything was based on scarcity, the idea that there were few choices, few options for the audience, and they had to be content with whatever was provided. Obviously, one of the things that was really striking for me in thinking about this presentation was the idea that text was king, and there was very little room for visual journalism to exist and be useful to the audience. Unfortunately, the people that ran the organizations at the time believed that visual journalism could only be used to illustrate writers' concepts that were basically being produced as text stories. And that kind of limitation of literalism really deformed the way that we've created visual narrative. Then along came the revolution in that critical inflection point of the late 80s, and these are the changes that really occurred that have transformed the media landscape completely. Today, these are the things that are really the relevant situations. And what's interesting is that once upon a time information was scarce. Now it's audience time that is scarce. And media companies need to adapt and adopt a way of insinuating the media into the fabric of people's lives at a time when it's maximally convenient for the audience. So what should happen next? Marshall McLuhan, I think, said it best. And what he recognized was that there was an alternative form of language to text that existed, and it's been there since the dawn of time. And it basically, in the dawn of time, it was cave paintings and oral storytelling tradition that were the main mechanisms of spreading information that was useful to the population. Today that language is coming back and it's called multimedia. What's really critical about this slide is the idea that people learn best by working together and doing things together and training together and practicing, and then by teaching others. And the reason that this is important is because journalism needs to adopt the gaming paradigm and way of framing information. Because if you look at the bottom part of that, that's all about really a gaming environment. And I think if journalism can learn to use multimedia in a game-like way, it can really be enhancing. The thing about this is that multimedia connects the specific situation of a particular moment or set of facts or a set of observations, and it connects it to the underlying truth about the human condition. And I am subject to a certain kind of learning disability. And for me, visual communication has always been incredibly important, incredibly powerful as a way of getting to absorb new information. And I think that multimedia can enable us to reach many more sets of audiences in a particular way that's useful like that. Okay, so talking about this, each type of media element has a particular kind of attribute that makes it unique, a certain kind of DNA characteristic, if you will. And I think the great multimedia journalism in the future is going to be people actually performing like chemists building polymers that will experiment with different types of media elements, and the way that we fuse those and put those together is what's going to really create and make a rich story. So these are still the essential critical journalistic questions that have to be answered as we think about a new paradigm and a new framework for journalism. These are all still critical questions that must be addressed by whoever's being the practitioner. So to me, this is kind of what the landscape could look like of new journalism companies, where we move away from the sort of the factory model of very much command and control, working in silos, very structured, very sheltered, and it becomes much more organic and a bit like the medieval craft sense of craftsmen in Europe in the Middle Ages. And I think that we have to move to this kind of a model in order to realize the full potential of journalism and its relevance, and in particular the visual journalism part of it. So what's happening now is that I think wise people who are creating content, media content, are recognizing that not only that people consume media at different times of the day for different reasons on different devices, and that for media to be effective and to be communicating, it has to be able to be understood to be breaking apart and then coming together on these various devices. And again, each of the devices themselves carry certain properties that enable a certain kind of communication to go forward. So I might do a video that would be aimed at being produced on a website, but it might have very different characteristics if I tried to deliver it to, say, a platform like this iPhone. And we need to think about those things and engage those. So one of the things that I think is going to happen is that professionals and amateurs are going to come together in a much more tight bond than previously. This idea that we are sort of a cult of priests as journalists, and we tell you what the news agenda is, and you have to listen to us and only to us, and you only know what we can tell you that we know, that's breaking up, obviously. And I think that what's important is that we still have a role to play in helping people act as curators, and filtering agents to separate the wheat from the chaff on the internet. And there's so much signal, we have to change the signal to noise ratio of the internet to make information that's valuable so that people can make the wise choices about their lives. So what I see happening is that old media eventually collapses of its own weight if it can't reform in the ways that I'm suggesting it needs to. And I think that visual journalists will come together in small, nimble companies, and they will outperform and make content that's perceived by the audience to be much more valuable than what's coming from mainstream journalism today. One of the things that multimedia does is it unites geographic communities and communities of interest. This is sort of the landscape that I see happening with multimedia. It's the new news conversation, and it has all these attributes, all these parts, and they're coming together in a rich, flowering way, if you will, and that's hence the metaphor. So what I'm asking is, all the smart VCs in the audience, think about this, and I'm not being facetious about this at all. What I see happening right now with journalism is that philanthropies, venture capitalists, foundations are investing in investigative journalism because they recognize that that kind of accountability journalism is essential to the swift and efficient functioning and necessary functioning of democracy. And as such, it can make a really profound contribution. I would like to submit that I think multimedia storytelling, if it's invested in the same way, has the same kind of carrying capacity and ability to create a much more informed citizenry. So my hope is that we will get to a stage where the people with the power to invest will invest in these small startup multimedia production companies to enable us to create the kind of content that will reach an audience. Thank you very much.